Shadow, emotion, mood, storytelling, lighting, these are all important elements of the dramatic portrait. Over the course of this tutorial, we're going to take you through all of these different ingredients and how they form the foundations and the pillars of portraiture, and more specifically the dramatic portraiture. This can be an intimidating process. What kind of lights do I get? Where do they go? What kind of power settings? All of this can be a lot to take in, and so what we're going to do is we're going to break it down and go step by step and dissect the tools that we use and how they can apply to how you speak the language of light. So we're going to start with the tools, the technical side of lighting. What light does, how light behaves, how we can shape it, how we can manipulate it, and how we can use it to work for us. And it's kind of meant to be a little bit of a review, but also just to make sure that everyone works on the same page and we're all kind of talking the same words in the same language. Then from there, we're going to work through 3 different shoots, and we're going to use the techniques that we cover in technical lighting, and we're going to continually build on them to create more complicated sets. Years ago when I was learning, I hunted for behind-the-scenes videos and images that would help me dissect larger sets. And so what we are going to do is give you a total walkthrough and a behind-the-scenes, just like you were being on set with me, as we break down and walk through some pretty complicated setups. All of the techniques are rooted very firmly in the fundamentals that we're going to cover, but you're going to see as we build on those techniques and we compound the fundamentals to create these very dynamic, very unique, much more complex sets. And we're going to start with something relatively simple, a single light setup from a big source. And then we're going to develop it and add to it and really create much more unique and detailed and complex setups as we move through the process. And you'll see me working through this whole process and figuring out problems and encountering obstacles and how I would address them and how I work around them. We also have Lindsay Adler, someone you might recognize. She's going to be assisting me on set, and she's a great collaborator for myself, someone who shares a lot of sensibilities. Now you're going to see a lot of attention being put on how we shape and craft light, and that's obviously very important to the process. But probably a more important part of the process is the idea of the narrative or storytelling, or what the purpose of the shot happens to be. And what we're really going to do is we're going to break down this process and the ideas behind the shoot so that we can create light that helps fulfill the narrative, not the other way around. Beyond the technical elements of the shoot, the lighting and the setup and all of these things, we're actually going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to focus on the narrative, the storytelling, the purpose of the shot. What is really the meat of what these images are about? Probably much more important than just how to light it. So we're really going to dig into these images and we're going to explore the concept and what they're about. And we're really going to focus on that because it's actually a lot more important than just how we create the images technically. I wanted to make this tutorial because I love the dramatic portrait and I love teaching. And I've had several of these ideas floating around for quite a while. You'll see in the 3rd shoot, it's something I've been working on for close to 2 years, from the original concept to drawing it out and planning it out and really trying to make it happen. So all of these images are personal projects of love for me and labors of love, and it's something that I've personally invested a lot of time into the production and planning of, and we've spent a lot of time putting this together. And the whole point was to just make the highest possible quality educational experience for you. Even though it may seem like we're working on a big set, you can still take all of these tools and you can just shrink it down, and it can work in a variety of ways, and vice versa. I personally shoot pretty small a lot of the time, but all we're doing is increasing the scale. So the concepts are universal, the ideas are universal, and the ways in which we work across the board in whatever capacity you want to work so that you can make these dramatic images. Before we can explore the different ways to use light, we have to look at not just how we see light, but how we see a photograph. The human brain is wired to pick up on certain things first, and it's important to know what those things are so that we can decide as image makers if we're going to reinforce those perceptions or intentionally break them. The middle. We notice things in the center of the image first, and we work outward toward the edges. The brightest part. Our eyes are attracted to the most luminous part of the image. This is one of the most important tricks of directing the eye. Areas of contrast. Our eyes also gravitate towards contrast, and this can be done either through luminance or color, specifically complementary colors. Highly saturated colors. Warm colors more than cools. The more saturated a color is, the more our eyes notice it. Be careful not to overwhelm your viewer by making the entire image highly saturated. Use pockets of saturation to draw the eye exactly where you want it to go. Human faces. We recognize faces, even those that are out of focus or obscured, and there's a hierarchy to this. In the order: faces in focus, looking at camera; faces in focus, not looking at camera; visible faces, but out of focus; backs of heads; full bodies with a discernible face; and then finally, full body with no discernible face. Patterns. We are drawn to patterns and shapes that don't occur naturally or often in nature. Additionally, we're not wired to appreciate the pattern, but instead seek to find the break in the pattern. And we find these anomalies visually compelling. What we look at first is important. Stepping back and asking ourselves the question, what is the purpose of the shot, is essential to the process. It's a seemingly simple concept, yet it's one that's often forgotten. In dramatic portraiture, we use the components of drama, darkness, shadow, contrast, expression, and mood, to shape our perception and feelings about a photograph. So it's fundamental to know how to direct that response.
All right, so we're going to begin by talking about a couple of different qualities of light. Now, the point of this is not really to start from the ground up. It's more about trying to make sure everybody starts on the same page. So we're going to be using a lot of different terms and talk about the language of light. And so as we progress through the course of this tutorial, we just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So that's kind of where we're starting from here. Now, the other thing you're going to see me use quite a bit is a light meter, and I'm using a Sekonic 358. Light meters are super handy, quick ways to read light and visualize what's happening in the scene. And some people don't really like to use them, which is fine. There's not really you have to use it, but I do find it super helpful. So I will be using it a lot over the course of this tutorial. So let's jump right into it. We're going to talk about the two main descriptors of light first. Probably the two most common things you'll hear when you talk about descriptions of light. And that's going to be hard light and soft light. Okay? And we're going to start with hard light. Now today we are shooting on the Pentax 645Z. We're tethered directly into Lightroom, and we have a ProPhoto D2 monolight as our key light. And most of what you're going to see here for a little bit is going to be just single light setup until we change otherwise. And we have our model helping us out today. This is Mariah. She's going to be standing in and be our demonstration for a lot of these characteristics. So let's jump right into it. We've got hard light, or direct light in this particular case. We're going to talk about direct light a little bit later, but this is hard light. And hard light is defined by very abrupt transitions. It's very contrasty light. So if you pay really close attention to the shadow area of the face, the shadows by the nose, you'll see that the edge of the shadow is pretty hard. Now, you'll also notice that hard light tends to be very specular, and what that means is it really accentuates a lot of the highlights. So over on this side of the face, you see that the shiny bits are all picked up, and they're pretty visible. Hard light's also going to accentuate texture. Sometimes you want this, sometimes you don't. It really depends on who your subject is and what you want them to look like. So remember, as we move through this, there's not really a right or a wrong way. It really always ends up on preference and what your personal preference is. So that's a really important characteristic of it. We're just going to talk about the different ways you can use it, because at the end of the day, most photographers use the same toolbox. We use the same kinds of light, we use the same kinds of modifiers. It's just really a matter of how you want to articulate your vision and how you want to articulate those tools to facilitate the final image. So we're going to start with direct light, direct hard light, and it's pointed directly at the subject's face. Okay? As you can see, I move it around. We just kind of have this centered on the subject's face. And what I'm going to do here, I'm at 8 power, but I'm going to grab my flash meter and I'm going to point it right at the subject's face. And I'm going to meter it right on the face. And it's telling me f10. So I'm going to set my camera to f10. I want to take a quick little shot here. All right. And here we are. Okay. So as you can see, especially when we zoom in quite a bit, right, we can see this hard defined shadow on the edge of the nose. And that is what we really want to pay attention to. So that's hard light. It's going to be a very crisply defined edge, specular light. It's a very contrasty light overall. And that's what we've got right here. Now, moving on, we're going to add a softbox to this light to create soft light. There's a lot of different ways you can create soft light. You can bounce it off a wall, you can run it through a diffuser, it can be clouds. If you imagine hard light being the sun, the clouds make the light soft. It's a way to modify light. And we're going to talk a little bit more about hardness and softness a little bit more specifically later, but we're just going to add a softbox to it. And this is a 4x6 softbox. And on the inside, you have an inner baffle. Okay? And this is double baffled, and this does a couple of things. One, it's going to soften the harshness of the hot spot in the middle, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second. And also, it's going to spread the light a little bit more evenly throughout the entire shape of the softbox. So this is ultimately going to change this light, which we're not going to change the power of. We're not going to change the position of too much. And it's basically going to change the characteristic of that light into something much softer. Okay. Now you can already see the light is drastically different. We have the light, the middle of it, pointed at her face, roughly, and it has completely changed the appearance of the shadow on the background. Before it was very, very hard, and now you almost can barely see it at all. The transitions on the side of the face become much softer. On the nose becomes much softer, and overall the light becomes less aggressively contrasty. Now, the other benefit of soft light is it tends to diminish the appearance of texture. It also lowers specularity. So the soft light ends up looking a lot more flattering on a lot of different skin types. Now, you don't necessarily always want light to look super flattering. Sometimes you want that more aggressive appearance that you get from hard light, but this becomes a way to soften the light as a different aesthetic. Now we're going to meter this again. So before I was at f10, and I've got 2 baffles on it, which should force me to lose a little bit of light. But just as a double check, let's meter by the face. And I've gone to 9. So I only lost about 1/3 of a stop. There we go. Okay. So if we zoom in on the face, you'll notice the catch light becomes much larger. It's much more visible. The edge of the shadow becomes much less abrupt, and overall the skin looks quite a bit softer. If we compare it between the hard light and the soft light, we can see pretty dramatic changes in the overall image. Overall, like the position of the light hasn't changed. It's still coming from the same side. The background becomes lit a little bit more smoothly, and the face also becomes lit a little bit more smoothly as well. Okay, and that's soft light. Now, we're going to talk about hotspot. I mentioned that a second ago. So when light comes out of the source and it hits a modifier, it is usually brighter in the center. And a workaround for this with a lot of different softboxes is they have an interior baffle, and that dissipates the light, spreads it out a little bit more, and it also helps fill the entire size of the softbox, which is really helpful. But a lot of people tend to just center the hotspot on the area they want to light. So if you want to light this position, what you'll end up doing is centering the light on it. And what that does is it points the hotspot down in this general direction. And that's not where we want to draw attention to. We always want to draw the attention to the face in a portrait because it's the most important part of the photo. So you want to make sure it's the brightest part of the photo. So take a look at how obvious the hotspot becomes when we take the inner baffle out. Let's remeter. And what you're going to see is a slight difference between the two, where the chest on the right image gets a little bit hotter. That becomes a little bit more obvious. Just a tiny bit brighter, maybe like a third of a stop, maybe up to a half a stop. And you can see the difference. Now where this stems from is something where we have to think about the shape of the light. Okay? So light moves through space. It moves through space in the shape of a cone. It's conical. So that means it starts here and it gets bigger the further it goes. Now obviously it loses power the further it goes, but in the middle it's the brightest spot. So that tends to be an area of light that can be really aggressive, and we don't necessarily always want to use it. So we want to use that area around the middle of the light. And to do this we do something called feathering the light. Now I'm going to put the baffle back in to soften that light a little bit more. Whoa. Okay? And at the moment, the light is pointed at her, which in turn is lighting the background pretty evenly. So I'm going to take one more just for control now that I've put the baffle back in. Great. And we're here. Okay, so we can clearly see the light on the background. And the brightest part of the image is lighting her. But if we turn this light, we start to get a little bit less light on the background. Now she's still pretty relatively close to the background, so this effect can actually be exaggerated even more if we were to pull her forward. So I'm going to show you the difference between the two. So this is flatten the image out by just turning it a little bit more off the background. But you can see we've also lost a little bit of light on the face as a result. But overall, the image has a much more even appearance. So to exaggerate this, I'm going to bring the light in much closer to her, and I'm going to show you how that effect changes. And I'm again start with her being lit and the background being lit. closer. Okay. And then as I move this off the background, and then can I have you scoot forward a little bit for me, please? Good. Great. You can see how it changes the appearance of the background and the image itself. Okay? So we go lighter to darker on the background just by turning the light and using less of its shape. All right, so that covers the descriptors of light: hard light, soft light, hot spot, fall off, and feathering. All right, so we started talking about the bigger descriptors of light, the hard light and the soft light. We're going to kind of explore that a little bit more complexly. And we're going to talk about direct light, diffuse light, and different kinds of reflected light, direct reflected and diffused reflected. So we're going to start with direct light. And direct light, as we mentioned in the first video, hard light, right? So direct light is when the light travels from the source to the subject without anything in between. It's usually very, very hard. And we're going to get a control on this just so we have a base to work from. And we're going to start with a little test. Okay, we're at 13. Okay. Perfect. Great. And just to reiterate, just like the hard light before, direct light is going to create these very harsh, abrupt transitions, these areas from light to dark. So you can clearly see the definition of the shadow. It creates more specular, more contrasty light, and it's usually a little bit harsher and more aggressive. Direct light. Now, let's move to diffuse light. And where the direct light might be something like the sun or a bare strobe, diffuse light is when you get some kind of semi-transparent material of some capacity in front of the light, and it's going to change the quality of light. It's usually going to soften it up a little bit. So the clouds blocking the direct sun is going to soften the light. Diffuse light can come from a softbox or a scrim or part of the reflector. A lot of different ways. Shower curtain. A lot of different ways you can diffuse light. We're going to use a scrim just to briefly block that light and soften it up. And so you can see instantly it softens all of the light. Oops. Right, the shadow on the faces become a little bit more gradual in their transition, and overall it flattens the contrast of the overall image. So we're going to take a little brief meter on this. Hold that up a little bit. Perfect. So it took us to 9, so we lost about a stop on that. Great. Now, at the moment, the diffusion was relatively close to the light, about this far away. So it did soften it up a lot, but it's still relatively hard compared to what we can do with it. And the further the diffusion gets from the source, the softer it will be. So we're going to do this one more time, and we're going to move the scrim a little bit further away from the source just to see the difference. And then if you can swing back a little bit and angle. Perfect. That's pretty good right there. And this just doubled the distance. It added about an extra foot. We're going to look at all three together. And you can actually see a noticeable difference between the three images. So obviously huge difference between the first and the other two. The shadow becomes a whole lot more gradual. But if you actually look at the difference between the second and third, in the second image, the nose shadow is a whole lot more defined, and in the third, the whole thing kind of meshes together a little bit more, and you create overall softer light. So the further your diffusion is from the light source itself, the softer it will be. All right, let's take this out of here. Good. Okay. Difference between direct and diffuse. Now we're going to move on to reflected light. And the two main ways we describe reflected light are going to be direct reflected and diffused reflected. And there's a little bit of variability in the diffused reflected light. Direct is pretty simple. It's like a mirror. And so we're going to bring the mirror in. And kind of like playing pool, and it bounces off the corner, right? It's very angular and in a straight line. So the mirror doesn't actually change the quality of light from the original source. So the original source in this particular case is still a hard direct light. So the light that bounces off of this onto the subject is going to be pretty hard. And if you kind of take a look at the wall over here from this shot, you can see this light creating its own shadow on the wall. And if you look at the source here on this wall, they're actually pretty similar in relative hardness, softness of light. This one's going to be a little bit more contrasty because this one's less power. We're losing power on the distance. So it travels there, it hits here, and it comes off, as opposed to just going from there to here. And so the distance from there to there is less than them going from here to here. So it's less powerful, but the quality of light stays the same. Hard light here, hard light here. You can use a mirror as fill, or you can use a mirror bouncing that main light off and changing to key. And we're actually going to talk about the jobs of light, key light and fill light, a little bit later, but just know that diffused or reflected light, usually direct reflection or diffused reflection light, usually works pretty well as a way to manipulate the shadows. So we saw the direct light with nothing first, and we're going to use that as the control. And now that we have this in, we're going to get a little bit of fill on that side. I'm moving my aperture back up a full stop because we got rid of that one-stop diffusion. So I know that I'm going to have my exposure back up to that full stop. Okay. And we're going to compare the original hard light to this one. And if you look really closely, you can see the shadows have gotten a little bit brighter. Now this is an analog system. Analog system means we can't change the power through a dial, but we can change the power through distance. So anytime we use a diffuse reflection or a direct reflection, or we use scrims, or even a lot of times when we use these lights, whether you're using continuous lights or strobes, one of the ways you can change the power is the dial. The other way you can change the power is through distance. So if we move the mirror in, it's going to create a stronger effect, and we're going to have a brighter fill. Now, there we go. Bigger difference there. Now, the other thing we have to pay close attention to when you're using reflection is the angle. So at the moment, the light's coming in from the side, and it's creating this clear reflection on the jaw. But if you just want to fill the shadows in more evenly, you want to make this fill more from the front, because that's the plane where the camera is going to be, and you're going to have less of this dark area in the middle, which can look a little bit unflattering. So I'm going to kind of fill this around from the front. Unfortunately, I have a little bit on the background, but it's not super noticeable. And you can see just by rotating the angle of the fill, we can actually change the appearance. I think the one on the right looks a little bit more natural, and it looks a little bit more flattering. You don't get that weird area in the middle of the face where you don't have filled in shadows. But you can kind of see a little bit of the two sources coming in because it is really aggressive. This isn't necessarily my preferred way to reflect, but you can kind of see the effect. All right, let's take that out of there. All right, Next, we're going to get to diffuse deflection. And diffuse deflection can come about in a lot of different capacities. You can use a reflector. You can use a V-flat. You can even use an umbrella. It's basically light hitting a surface, but instead of bouncing back like a pool ball at the same angle, it's going to hit the object and just scatter. And diffused reflection is usually the softest and some people think prettiest way to reflect light. And you'll see it in white, you'll see it in silver, gold, you'll see zebra surfaces, which are a combination of different things. The couple that we're going to look at, we've got a white and a silver reflector, and we've also got a V-flat. And we're going to show you both how that looks as a fill light, as a fill, and also as a key. And they can both work in a variety of different ways to quickly manipulate your single source. So, thank you. First thing we've got is just a simple handheld reflector. This one's got a silver and a white, but you'll see that these come in a whole lot of different configurations. You've got 5-in-1s where they've got the diffusers on the inside, and black on one side and zebra on another, and they're all great. I always say that these reflector kits are like the Swiss Army knife for photographers. They're really one of the most useful things you can carry around in your bag. If you're going to shoot on location, it's one of the first things I'll grab. Now, the silver reflection kind of exists somewhere in between that soft, white, totally massively diffused light and the mirror. So the silver is going to be a little bit harder, a little bit more aggressive, and a little bit more contrasty. So I'm going to show you the differences between a silver and a white as a way to manipulate fill. So come on in for me. Great. So we're going to start with the silver. And let's actually drop it for control, just so we get one more. Take it all the way out. Great. All right, so we're back to this. And let's bring the silver in. Bring it a little bit more out of the front for me, please. And then point it at perfect. Okay. And we're going to look at the two of these side by side. Great. So you can see it's not quite as strong as the mirror. But it is still pretty punchy. Let's bring the white in as well. Great. And then we're going to look at all three of these together side by side. There we go. Okay. So on the left, we've got nothing. In the middle, we've got silver reflector. It's a little bit brighter and a little bit more contrasty. And then the right side, it brings up those shadows a little bit in a pretty even way. Again, analog system, closer it comes to the subject, the brighter it is, the further away, the darker it is. Now, also, we're just manipulating shadows here. If we want to use this as a way to manipulate the key, it becomes a really useful way to soften your key light. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip the head around and we're going to bounce the light off of the white side and the silver side to show you the difference. In a pinch, I have been used, I've been used when I was wearing a white t-shirt as a reflector, or I've even had lights bounce off of a white shirt. So it just really needs to be a white surface, can be really handy. So we're going to start with the silver. Great. Now, the thing about hand holding this is you end up getting a lot of variety, so you want to make sure the person holding it tends to really know how to point the light. But you can kind of see how we can angle the light, and it really changes the quality of it depending upon how it moves around. Okay? You'll also notice it's pretty hard. Let's go right there. It's pretty hard right here, but it's a little bit softer. And we're also going to lose quite a bit of light when we do this. So I'm at 8. I was at 13, so I lost about 1 1/3 stops. And so it softens the light a little bit, but it's still pretty contrasty. Obviously, a bigger reflector further away is going to soften this light more, and the closer the light is to your source, the harder it's going to be. Let's flip it around. Let's do the white. Great. Now, the white, unfortunately, loses even more power. That's kind of the trade-off. It's going to make the light softer, prettier, but it is going to drastically diminish its power. I'm at 6.3. Okay. And if we look at the two, especially when we look really closely under the eye, we can really see how those shadows have softened up tremendously. Becomes a nice, easy, quick way to soften the light. And another way to create reflected light is to use an umbrella. Same idea, bounce umbrella, right? Two kinds of umbrellas we commonly use, shoot through and a bounce. We're talking about reflection, so we are going to use a bounce umbrella. And usually umbrellas come in white or silver. You'll also see sometimes gold. You'll notice I didn't use a gold reflector before either, because I think they always look pretty terrible. So I never use gold for anything. I'm only going to use white and silver. So we're going to use a white umbrella. I traditionally almost always gravitate toward white umbrellas. You lose a little bit of power, but it usually presents a softer light, and that's generally just what I personally tend to go for. So we're going to use a giant, large Profoto umbrella. It's a Profoto Deep, so it's parabolic. It's a little bit deeper. Great, that's fine. Okay. I'm a big fan of umbrellas. I find that umbrellas are probably one of the most hated on and underappreciated kinds of modifiers out there. Umbrellas have been used for a really long time, and they work really well, and they're relatively inexpensive. So I'm a big fan of them. People always say they don't really give you as much control. They do if you kind of know how to use them, and they're really easy to use. So what we have right now is a giant umbrella, and it's kind of lighting her pretty evenly. We just want to make sure that it's pointed at her face. I'm going to bring that up a little bit. All right. And I'm going to take one quick little test shot here. Oops. All right, so we're at 14. I think I changed the power a little bit. All right. And so what we have is this really beautifully soft light that kind of just paints the entire scene with light. Now, there's different ways you can modify this. You can also add a diffusion to it, so it becomes diffused, reflected with an extra layer of diffusion that's going to make it even softer and diminish the power a little bit. And we'll get there a little bit later. But for now, just basic diffused light. Now, the cool thing about this is it is actually a lot more adjustable than people necessarily want to give it credit for. So we can feather it, just like we would the softbox, and at the moment it's lighting the scene, right? If you turn this, you can really control what that light's looking like. So, just as an example, still the same power on her, and the background light is going to change a bit. This basically takes all the light off the background, and then we can also kind of go somewhere in between the two, like this. And it's three ways to control that umbrella light. I'm going to do one more on this last one so we can exaggerate that a little bit more. You know, very subtle differences in how the umbrella can control both your subject and the background. All right, so the other key way to change the umbrella is by manipulating the focus. So if you look at this background, you can see that the shadow cast by the umbrella is pretty soft. As I move the umbrella closer in, that shadow gets really hard. And the same kind of thing happens on the face. You start to see a more clearly defined shadow right next to the nose. So if you want the light to be a little bit harder, you bring it in. If you want it to be a little bit softer, you push it out. And so that's just an extra way to manipulate the shadow or control the transition, the hardness or the softness of light with these umbrellas. Okay, now we're going to bring in V-flats. And for the sake of consistency, we're going to take this umbrella out, go back to the hard key, Yep. Okay. So back to the hard key. Now we're going to remeter this, obviously. All right. So we're bringing in the V-flat. And again, we take a look at diffuse reflection, which is exactly what this V-flat's going to be. But the benefit of this is it's bigger, which means it's going to be softer. And it also has the capacity to cover a full body because it's so big. Now V-flats usually or often you'll see are white on one side and black on the other, and the black allows you to create something called negative fill, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But we're just going to use it as a way to manipulate the fill on the shadow side, and then we're going to use it as a key light to show you how to create soft light when you don't have a softbox and you need to in a pinch. So let's go ahead and bring that soft V-flat in. So we brought the V-flat in relatively close. Remember, this is, again, an analog system, so the closer it is, the brighter the fill is going to be. The more you back it up, the less powerful that fill is going to be. And so basically what we're doing is we're coming in and we're just filling in the shadows on this side of the face. Nuts. There we go, one more time. All right. Let's turn that down a little bit so we get it closer to where it was before. I think it was at 8 too. That's better. Okay, so now this is pretty close, and we're going to use, let's take it out as a comparison shot, just to kind of show you what that looks like. Okay, so the image on the left has the V-flat in pretty close. Image on the right has no V-flat. And you can kind of see how it allows us to brighten up the shadows a little bit. All right, so you may be asking, why are we spending so much attention talking about filling in the shadows? Well, it has largely to do with the idea of giving ourselves the most flexibility in post-production. So if you kind of visualize the develop module, whether you're in Lightroom or Capture One, I use Lightroom, you've got blacks, shadows, exposure, which is the midtones, you got highlights and whites. And so what I like to do, especially when I'm shooting a lot of dark, low-key tones, is really make sure my shadow tones are squarely in that shadow range. And so usually what I'll do is I'll bring a little bit more control, a little bit more fill into the shadows, just so I have a little bit more control. And basically what I try to isolate, especially when I'm doing really dramatically lit stuff, is I'll try to put the highlight tones, the key light tones squarely in the highlight. So as I move the highlight slider, it moves that pretty much by itself. And then when I put this in the shadow tones, I can actually control what the shadows on the face look like just with one slider. It just gives me a lot of flexibility. So, you know, all that said, that's why I'm spending so much attention on the crafting and the controlling of the shadows. Now, we're going to take the V-flat, that same tool, and we're going to use it as a key light. So we're going to put it over in the corner where the key light is, and we're just going to bounce the light into it. Okay. Now, bouncing a light into a V-flat, cheap, easy, usually pretty versatile solution to be able to create soft light. Again, it's about distance. The more inside the V-flat your light is, the harder it will be, and the more it comes out, the softer it will be, but you know that you're going to be exponentially losing power the further it goes. So there is a little bit of a threshold as far as how far you can move it. We're going to do a little test on this. Okay. And there you go. That is a simple, soft light via diffused reflection. So don't necessarily always think that diffused reflection has to always be reflection for the fill. You can also use that same idea to manipulate the light for the key. So what we've covered: direct light, diffused light, and then different kinds of reflected light, including direct reflection and diffused reflection. All right, so we've talked about hardness and softness of light, but what really determines hardness and softness of light? Well, you might think it's about diffusion or modification or power, but it's actually about size or relative size. So the smaller a light source is in relation to the subject, the harder it's going to be. Think of the sun. It's massive and large, but it's also millions of miles away. So even though it's a big light source, it's very small compared to us. So it's very hard, specular, contrasty light. But when you have the clouds blocking it, the light source becomes much larger relative to us, and it becomes much softer. So yes, we can modify light to make it softer. We can also change the distance. And we're going to illustrate this in a few different concepts. We're going to start by using a relatively small light source. Then we're going to change it to a larger version of that light source. And then we're going to move that large light source so that you can see how the hardness and softness changes with distance. So we're going to start with this Profoto small umbrella. Now the reason we're using a small is only to kind of illustrate size differences. Soft boxes come in a variety of different sizes, and the same principles apply. But we're going to be using the umbrellas to illustrate the concept today. So we're going to start with this small umbrella. It's a small white umbrella. It's relatively soft light. But the edges are a little bit harder than they might be with a bigger light source. So again, this is where we're starting. Small umbrella. It works just to light the face. Probably wouldn't want to use this kind of an umbrella to light the whole body. To increase the size of the spread, we'd back the light off. But when you increase the size of the spread, you're also changing the way the light looks. So even though it might light the figure more evenly, it's going to change the overall contrast. It's going to change the hardness or softness of light. So what you end up seeing, and what you're going to see over the course of this tutorial, is when we have to light either a larger group of people or a larger scene, all we're going to do to maintain that level of softness is just increase the size of the modifier. So that's what we're going to do now. So we've now got the larger, this is an XL umbrella, and it comes in a variety of sizes. We've gone from small to XL to really illustrate the point. You're not going to see a huge difference between like a large and an XL. You're not going to see a huge difference between maybe a 4 and a 5 foot octa. But you know, there is still a little bit of a difference. It's just illustrated a little bit more clearly here. Now, by using a really large modifier, which is what you're going to see us doing over the next few days, is we're doing something I like to call broad brush lighting, painting with a big brush, which is to say I'm using one giant source to light the scene pretty evenly. A common mistake that you see a lot is a lot of people will, when they need to light a bigger scene, bring in more lights all the way around, and that's going to change the overall shape of the light. So if you want the light to look like it comes from one big source and still be soft, you just got to increase the size of the modifier. So that's what we're doing now. So we've gone from the small umbrella, we're now at the large umbrella. We're going to do a quick little reading on this. That's the same. And if we look closely, especially at the nose shadow, what you end up seeing in this image is there's a little bit less overall contrast with this larger light source because the light's bouncing more places and all around the scene. So what you're actually seeing is the shadow side is a little bit lighter in the large umbrella size, and the definition on the shadow shape is a little bit more gradual in this bigger source. So if you want that softer, prettier, softer light, you're going to want to go with a much bigger source. Now, the light source is relatively close to the subject. I can move it in closer. I can really make it big and soft. And so I'm going to show you as we change the actual position. That's the next big important thing we have to think about when it comes to modifying the source. So I'm going to bring this in real close. And we're going to meter this. Okay. That's a little bit brighter, 2/3 of a stop, so we're going to bring it up to 8. And we're not going to see a huge difference between these two, but it may give us a little bit of a difference. So the one extra benefit, it is a little bit softer, and we can see it especially by the nose in that transition, but because we brought it in closer and we haven't changed the power of the light, we've ended up making these shadows darker. So when you bring the light closer and you don't adjust the power, you effectively have to change the f-stop to incorporate it, which is going to make the darks darker. All right, so we've taken a look at this large umbrella relatively close. Now what we're going to do is we're going to push it quite a bit back, probably about 10, 12 feet. And we're going to change the relative size of it to show you the difference in how the light looks. Now we're also, as we change this, not just changing the distance, but in order to keep the light the same, the lighting pattern on the face relatively the same, we're going to raise it up a little bit to keep the angle consistent. We got to kind of move it back at the angle it was coming in at. Let's see, put it about right here. There we go. Something like that. That's all right. We'll make do. Okay. Okay. So we were right here when it was close. We're also going to lose a whole lot of power out of this as well. So let's take a little meter. Okay, so we've gone down to 3.2. Huge loss of power. And it's completely changed the look of the image. It's lowered the overall contrast, it's changed the quality of light, and truth be told, it kind of defeats the purpose of using a large umbrella like this, or a large modifier for that, for that matter. So if you got a big modifier, you really want to make it look soft, bring it in close, and you'll get that soft light. Because when you bring it further away, you might as well be using a smaller modifier, and you're not really getting a lot of these soft characteristics out of the light that you would if you had it close. Now, we've lost a lot of power, and just to kind of illustrate the difference, on the last image, we were at 6.3. So I'm now at 3.2. I need to increase the power a little bit to see if we can get something comparable to at least show you how to fix that distance. Let's kind of meter that. Not yet. I was about at 7 before, so we actually may not even be able to get it all the way up to 6.3. That's the total loss of power out of this. I got up to 9. As you can see, it takes a little bit of finagling. That's close enough. We're about a third of a stop off. Okay, so even at about the same aperture, the difference is massive. You're just not getting anywhere near the same mood to the shot when you pull that modifier all the way back. Although, relative size is usually the big determining factor for hardness or softness of light. There's one key exception. And that's an exception that we're going to be using a little bit over the course of this tutorial, the scrim. And it's because the scrim is probably one of the biggest modifiers you can get. It comes in a lot of different sizes. We were going to bring out a 6-footer in a second, 6 foot, 8 foot, and even much bigger than that. Because, generally speaking, when you just want to light more of the scene, you just make the modifier bigger. But the scrim has a variety of ways you can work with that. And that's because the light position behind the scrim changes. And that changes the way the light that comes through it looks. And so we're going to show you a few different variations on that. That's kind of one of the great things about the scrim is you can really shape the quality of light to be exactly what you want it to be by how you manipulate the light behind it. Imagine being able to change the position of the light inside a softbox, and it's kind of that idea. So let's go ahead and bring the scrim in. I'm going to swing around. I'm going to go this way. Then you come around to me. Uh-huh. All right, great. Good. Oh, we're going to make it work. Swing it around a little bit more. Great. And then we're going to angle it a little bit. A little bit more. Great. Let's bring it up. Keep going. Great. That's probably good right there. We're going to a little bit lower because she's going to be sitting. So there. Good. All right, so we just put up the scrim and we brought in a boom arm so we can have a little bit more accessibility and range of movement as far as putting the light in the middle of the scrim. And as we said a second ago, this is a little bit of a different way to use the size of the source, and we can manipulate it a little bit more. And this is a 6-foot Westcott scrim jim on a boom. And so we're going to start with the light relatively close to the scrim. And if you look on the other side of the scrim, you can actually see the shape of the light. It's about this big. Okay? And that helps us visualize what kind of source the light's going to be. And when it's really close, the light is relatively small. As you back it up, the cone gets bigger. So we're going to start with it pretty small. It's still pointed at her face, but you'll also notice the light is pretty hard. It's not super hard, but it's pretty hard. So you still have these pretty clearly defined shadows by the nose and on the cheek and everything else. So we're going to get a little meter on this. And it's pretty bright. We're at f13. Now, the light itself is pretty much at full power, so you can see that even through this one stop of diffusion, we're still getting a pretty decent aperture out of it. There we go. Okay. So we have lots of contrasty light. The shadows are still pretty dark because we are shooting at an f13. If we were to lower that aperture down from f13, lower the power, we'd end up lightening up those shadows a little bit. We could also, if we wanted, bring in a white V-flat to fill in those shadows. So a couple of different ways that we can manipulate what this light looks like. Now, we're going to take this boom, we're going to back it up a little bit. And what that's going to do is it's going to change the spread of that cone of light. And it's going to fill more of the scrim, and it's going to make the light softer. But as it spreads, it's going to dissipate, and we're also going to lose a little bit of power. So let's move that back kind of as far as we can. There you go. Great. Now, you can see this almost instantly. So if you do me a favor, bring it in close again. Pay close attention to the shadow on the face here. And you can see it becomes really defined when it's close. And then as it backs away, that shadow softens up tremendously. So we're down to 9. We lost about a stop. And so it's really only gone back a couple of feet, but you can already see there's a difference between the two. There's still a pretty clearly defined shadow over on that side of the face, but it is much softer. And obviously the further we moved it back, the softer it would be. Now we're going to do one more thing to increase the size of the spread in a smaller space. And we're actually going to run a modifier through it. And so sometimes you'll see an octabox be shot through a scrim, which cuts the light down a little bit, but it's also going to create a larger spread for the scene. What we're going to use is an umbrella. And the reason I like to use an umbrella on this particular method is because it almost completely eliminates the hot spot altogether. The benefit of using a diffuse reflection source like an umbrella already doesn't have a hot spot. Using the light shot straight through the scrim is going to create a hot spot. And for the same reason that we use double diffusion on the larger 4x6 softbox to soften that hot spot up, this is kind of sort of doing the same thing, but it's bouncing before it gets in, which is softening the light up even more. Of course, it's also cutting down on the power a lot, so we're going to be shooting at f10. Or sorry, we're going to be shooting at 10 full power on this. So you're actually going to see a big loss of power. But it's going to spread more evenly across the scrim. It's going to give us a more even, soft light source all the way through. Okay. So let's wheel this out a little bit. You know, hold that for me right there.
Yep.
Just
got it.
Hold that in.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, all right, something like that. All right, just hold that for me. It's going to slide around a little bit. All right, so the light drastically going to come down. So we were at 9. We're coming down to 6.3. So we lost another stop out of that. But in the process, we've created much softer light. And so here's the 3. And you'll see a little bit of a difference between 2 and 3, not as much as you would between 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, but the difference between 1 and 3 is pretty drastic. So you see it just adds a little bit more softness to the light. And obviously, the further it goes back, the softer it becomes. I like shooting it this way because it tends to eliminate a hot spot and it just helps give you a little bit more of that soft, painterly light across the whole image. So there you go. That is using relative size to change the hardness and softness of light. We started with a small umbrella, we moved to a large umbrella, and then we moved that large umbrella back to change the quality of that light. Then we brought in the big exception to that, which is the scrim, which is what you're going to see a little bit over the course of the next few videos. All right, now we're going to talk about the position of light, the relative position of light, and what those positions of light do to the lighting patterns on the face. So, as you've seen, the light moves around, and when the light moves around your subject, that changes how things look on the subject's face. And there's a couple of different ways you can change how the light appears on your subject's face. And one of those ways is by physically moving the light. And notice how the patterns on the face change. Okay? The more the light goes to the side, the more dramatic your light will be. Obviously, the position around the subject isn't the only way you can manipulate the lighting pattern on the face. You can also, there we go. You can also move it up and down, which we're going to get to in just a second. But for now, we're going to use the position of light to articulate what those terms mean when the light moves around the face. So if we start all the way over here on the side, we have something known as split light. Point that down a little bit. There we go. And split light cuts the subject's face in half and puts half of the face in shadow, hence why we call it split. And I'm going to take a little reading on this just so we can take a photo. There we go. All right. Now it's a super, super dramatic light. Half that face is in shadow, half of the face is in light. It's to the side. It rakes across the face, so it's not necessarily always the most flattering light, but it is super dramatic. As the light comes around a little bit more, the next position we're going to take a look at is something known as Rembrandt light, named after the Dutch painter, Rembrandt. And because he was notorious for this triangle of light on the unlit side of the face, that is what we are creating. And you can see that by putting half the face in light and the other half is in shadow, except for this triangle of light. There's a couple of things we look for when we're doing Rembrandt light, and one of those things is making sure we have a catch light in both eyes. We can see the reflection of the light in both eyes. And we want to make sure this triangle is closed. And that's usually one of the key descriptors of that. And it can be a small triangle, it can be a big triangle. As soon as the triangle opens up, it becomes something different. And as soon as the triangle goes away, it becomes split. So it kind of works in between. It's this really great way to show dramatic light, but also put both of the eyes in light. Now, what you'll notice under the nose right now is that light is pointed to the side, and it's creating this lit area above the mouth. That can be a little bit distracting. The way we get around that is either by moving the subject's face, and she can tilt down a little bit. Keep that straight. Good. Tilt your head down, and then tilt your head up. And you can kind of see how it changes. When she tilts her head up, makes it a little bit more obvious. As she tilts her head down, keep going, that triangle closes in. So obviously the higher the light is, the more that triangle points down. So if we also did this, if we raised it up, we could also change the shape of that triangle. So just a couple of different ways we can articulate this pattern, and we can fine tune it. And the Rembrandt light is going to look something like this. And there we are. We get that triangle on the unlit side of the face. Now at the moment, it's a little bit high. I can't quite see the catch lights in her eyes, so I could either ask her to raise her head, right? Perfect. A little bit less for me, please. That's great. Eyes open just a little bit more. There you go. Or we could lower the light, and either one of those two solutions would introduce the catch light into the eyes. Just brings a little bit more life back to the eyes. Now as this light moves around, you'll notice that triangle opens up, and now what we've got is something called loop. And the loop light pattern puts that little loop shadow right next to the nose. It can be pretty long, like this, or it can be pretty short, like this. And obviously the height is going to change the appearance of that as well. Bringing it down is going to make it shorter, closer to the nose. Bringing it up is going to make it longer. So one is not more correct than the other. That's just what they do. And it looks something like this. Okay. There we go. As we keep moving the light over, it's going to be a little bit tricky. Here we go. Right there. Usually you'd want to put this on something like a boom arm. And the nose shadow goes just underneath the nose. Turn your face a little bit more to the light. Perfect. You get something called butterfly light, or known by its other name, Paramount light, because it was used by the Hollywood studios back in the day, specifically the Paramount movie studio. And so again, when it's relatively low, the shadow's kind of short right here. As you raise it up, the shadow gets longer. The other benefit of this is as you raise it up, the cheekbones become a little bit more defined. And that looks like this. Turn your face a little bit more to the light for me, please. Perfect. Great. And then, of course, this changes the neck shadow as well. When it's high up, you've got a really strong neck shadow. As I lower it, the neck shadow changes. Great. There hasn't been too much of a discrepancy in light, which is why I haven't really been remetering. It's adjusted a tiny, tiny bit, but especially as we moved it around the side, I kept the distance away from the subject about the same, and that's why you didn't really see me adjusting the lights too much. Now, this pattern, it's important to remember with the patterns that it has nothing to do with the position of me. It has nothing to do with the position of the subject, in this case, which way she's turning. It has everything to do with the way the shadows look on the face. And that's usually how we use these terms as a descriptor. Also, it's worth noting that just knowing these terms doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it right in terms of light in the face, because there's a lot of variations, and you want to be prepared to be receptive to variations in the lighting pattern. You don't always have to go in and say, I'm going to create Rembrandt light, or I'm going to create split light. It can just be a good way to think about starting somewhere and then kind of getting a little bit creative. But know that the more light goes to the side, the more drama and contour you get. So, at the moment, we have the light straight at Mariah's face. If I have her turn a little bit this way, so the lighting pattern has changed, but if I move the light to the front of her, it's still Paramount light, okay? Because even though she's turned, it's at her front. It's creating that light under the nose. So there are a lot of different ways you can get a variety of lighting patterns, okay? So in this particular case, we're going to move the subject. So do me a favor, turn back to the front for me, please. Okay. And we're not going to move the light. We're only going to move the subject. Okay, so we have Rembrandt light from the front. It's a pretty harsh Rembrandt. We're almost losing the eye. We're almost into split, but it's still a Rembrandt. Let's rotate you a little bit. Perfect. Good. We've now, just by moving her, put her in split. And then do me a favor, turn back this way. That's good. We're in loop, and then turn a little bit more for me, please. Perfect. We're in a profile. I'm going to tweak a little bit. There we go. And that's our Paramount. So we can get this variety of patterns just by moving the subject. Also important to know, there are two other important descriptors when it comes to talking about these lighting patterns, and that's broad light and short light. And broad light basically means, turn your face to me, the side closest to camera is lit. That's broad light. Turn back this way. Short light means the light closest to camera is more in shadow. Those are the two big descriptors. You don't really get it so much with Paramount light, but you get it with loop, you get it with Rembrandt, and you get it with split. Okay? So what that basically means is you actually get to dictate overall drama, more shadow, more drama, and you can also use it as a way to change the shape of your subject's face. So if you want to broaden out the subject's face, you would use broad light. Makes the face look a little bit more broad. If you wanted to narrow your subject's face, you could shoot it more in short light, put it more in shadow, and it makes the face appear a little bit more narrow. So a couple of different ways that you can go about changing the shape of your subject's face. So this is kind of how you can decide which way to go with broad light or short light. Once you figure out your subject's best side, which oftentimes it's the left, but you know, you want to experiment both sides, see which way it goes the best. Is your left side? Okay, it's her left side. Most people will tell you, most people are really, really aware. Most people already know what their good side is. Another good way is when you're talking with your subject before you shoot, you'll notice they kind of lean in one way versus the other, and it becomes a good way to figure out what the best side is. So it's her left, and we're going to do Rembrandt in broad and short. So we're looking for that triangle on the unlit side of the face, and we're going to do one where she's facing the camera in broad light. So do me a favor, turn your face a little bit. Turn a little bit more, great. And I'm going to move the light to accommodate. And now what we have is the Rembrandt light, because the triangle on the unlit side of the face. Looks like that, which is great. And then we're going to go the other method, and I'm going to bring this around. Keep the face exactly where it is. And I'm going to create that same look, that same triangle of light on the unlit side of the face here. As a different variety. And there we go. Two different ways to show Rembrandt light. It can be broad light or it can be short light. And again, this works for all kinds of different lighting patterns. Split, loop, and Rembrandt. Becomes just different ways to show drama. All right, relative position. So I'm going to move around and I'm going to have her face move with me so you can see how the light changes as I move. So we're going to start right here. I'm going to come here. I'm going to come a little bit more drastically. And then we'll come this way. And I'm going to get a little bit of the background showing when I move all the way this way, but turn back to me. Good. Well, it's pretty dark, so. So, what we have is a series of images where I'm moving and the subject is shifting to me, but the light is not. And it changes the way the light shows up. So it's just one easier way, or it's another way to change light. And sometimes it's a little bit easier to do one, sometimes it's a little bit easier to do the other. Depends on how many lights you have, what's happening with your subject, so forth and so on. Now the other one is height. And so I'm going to bring this light in, and I'm going to put it right at about the face. Okay. All right. I'm going to go really low. I'm going to go right at the plane of the camera, and I'm going to go above. And it's going to change it from aggressive down lighting to very, very flat lighting to up lighting, just based on where I'm shooting from. And the cool thing about this is you can use height as a way to manipulate the appearance of things. Turn your face down to me a little bit. Perfect. Right at me. And then we're going to bring in the ladder. That's great. Okay. Thank you. And my position in the frame changed a little bit, but you can see that the height of the shadow completely changes as well. So it goes from down lighting to up lighting. The light didn't move. The only thing that moved was my position. So the other part we're going to look at this is we looked at relative height. So let's actually move it physically so we get that as a comparison. So at the moment, the light is relatively low. Yep. and it's creating light that's relatively flat because it's relatively close to the plane of the camera. But if we angle it down and we raise it up, we can create this light that really contours the cheekbones. Would also help if it's not in front of my frame. Okay. Now, what you have to worry about when you do this is going so high you skull out the eye sockets. And you don't get catch lights in the eyes. And this can be a thing, like this can be what you want, but know that when you do it, it definitely creates an effect that is real dark on the eyes. Oops, there we go. And this is an exaggerated version, obviously. So be careful about going too far. Here it is relatively close to the plane of the camera. You can see it because the nose shadow is pretty close. As the nose shadow gets longer and then longer and longer and longer, you start to get these sculling of the eye effects. I'd probably say if you want contour, that middle image is probably your sweet spot. If you want something a little bit flatter, the one on the left probably going to make a little bit more sense. We've now done physical position of the light. We've done lighting patterns. We've done relative position of the light, both horizontally and vertically, and what that means. So now we're going to take the model and we're going to take the light and we're going to move it together in relation to the background. And that's going to shape the way the background looks. However close you are to the background shapes the way the background looks. And for this, we're going to throw a softer modifier on the light because it helps control and shape the light a little bit more. This hard light tends to spread the light in every direction pretty substantially. So we're just going to put a 4-foot octa to help guide it a little bit more. Give us a little bit more control. So I'm going to have you move all the way back to the background, please. And we're going to keep the distance and the power between the light and the subject the same. Angle this down just a little bit. There we go. So we're probably a couple feet away from our subject. And then do me a favor, let's meter that, please. Okay, we're at f11. All right, we have a really nice, soft, beautiful light. Now, we're going to move her probably up about 6 feet. And you can see we have quite a bit of light on the background. Relatively similar distance. And that background has already gotten much, much darker. There we go. If we look at the two together, we can see substantial difference between the backgrounds in both of those two shots. And then we're going to do one more and we're going to make it even darker. So let's move you all the way up to the front. A little bit more. Great. And the idea here is that you can get a much larger versatility of your environment and your backgrounds and a lot more manipulation of what that's going to look like if you just learn to control the distance between the two. The further away your subject is from the background, the less light's getting it, the darker it's going to be. And bring it a little bit more this way. Great, yep. Great. Cool. All right, and those are the three images. So we started relatively close to the background, got a lot of light on it. As we move the subject off the background, less light on the background, still a little bit of light. As we moved her even further off the background, it just got darker and darker. So it gives you a really great flexibility simply without having to control any kind of lighting back here about what that light's going to look like. If you want more light on the background, you move your subject closer to the light. If you want less light on the background, you move it further away. And so that gives us the position of light. Physical position, and relative position of your subject to the background. So one of the more helpful ways to think about lighting is to think about intent or purpose. So if you give your light a job, it sometimes makes it a lot easier to think about. Sometimes a light can have multiple jobs. Sometimes it may only have one. For example, a light may light the subject and the background. It's doing two things, but it will help us understand and segment and organize our light if we think about what they do a little bit more specifically. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to break down jobs of light. For the most part, when you're lighting people, most light falls into one of these descriptors. So the first light we're going to take a look at is the key, or the main light. And this is the one that we have on right now. And the key light or the main light dictates the overall look and feel of your image. And we've already metered everything out and pre-lit everything, so it's all kind of set up and ready to go. But the idea behind it is to just kind of pay attention to what each of these lights do. So we're going to look at each of them individually, and then each of them as they add and build to lighting the scene. So, like I said, first light, key light, main light. It's a 4-foot octabox, and we are sitting here at f11. And by itself, the 4-foot octabox looks like this. All right. And it's dictating the overall look and feel of the scene. It's lighting Mariah in a loop style of light, almost a Rembrandt. It's pretty dramatic. You'll notice there's not a whole lot of light on the background. So we're going to really divide everything off. So we have this light. It's pretty dark over in the shadow side. So if we wanted to brighten that up, we would want to manipulate the shadows. And we talked a little bit earlier about different ways to manipulate the shadows, using reflectors, white reflectors, silver reflectors. You can also use lights. Lights give you a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more control. And so in this particular case, for our fill light, we've got a 4x6 softbox. And the reason I like to use something like this, I like to use a really big modifier for my fill light. The point of that is I don't actually like my fill light to be obvious. I don't like it to be obtrusive into the lighting of the image. So if you remember, when we brought in the mirror and we brought in the V-flat to the side, it was really obvious when it was too much to the side. But if you shift it more to the front, it starts to become a little bit less noticeable, and it controls the contrast of the scene in a way that is more even and less obvious. So I like to use a big soft modifier of some capacity right behind camera or relatively near to camera, so it doesn't create any of those weird shadows in the front. So that's what we've got here. We're going to take a look at the fill light by itself, and then we're going to take a look at the combination of the two. Now it's important to note that my exposure through this whole thing isn't changing. The key light, f11, my exposure isn't changing at all. I'm only using this light to manipulate the fill. So I'm going to talk about metering different lights at different settings. That doesn't change the overall exposure. The overall exposure is locked in. So again, f11, 5.6. Let's take a look at this by itself on f11. Okay, so the image itself is going to look pretty dark. It's meant to. It's underexposed. You're shooting something that meters f6 at f11. It's going to look dark. That's the point. But what this tells me is what the shadows are now going to look like. So that when I combine this with the key light, it's going to brighten up those shadows so the shadows look more like this. Perfect. And when we look at the two images together, we can see we've brought a bit of brightness into the shadows and we've lightened them up substantially. Now, if I lighten up this, I'm going to be able to, if I turn the power up, I'm going to be able to lighten up the shadows. And if I turn it down, I'm going to darken the shadows. So the benefit of using a fill light as opposed to a reflector is it gives you a lot more control in what you want those shadows to look like. So the third light we're going to take a look at is the rim light. And the rim light's job is to create separation of the subject to the background. And some people like using a rim, some people don't. It introduces this concept of multiple obvious forms of light, and some people prefer a light that feels more singular even when it's not. This definitely says, hey, there are multiple lights happening in the scene, and that's not inherently wrong, it's just a preference. So we're going to turn this rim light on, and this rim light is metered to balance the key, which you'll see in a second, which means the key and the rim have the same degree of power. And the reason we're using a rim is to alternate values of light and dark, because in a two-dimensional image, the way that we create and show depth is through alternating light and dark, or highlight and shadow. That's what defines depth or breadth in a two-dimensional space. And so we go light with the key, then it goes dark with the shadow side of the face, and then it goes light again with the rim, and that shows volume and it shows depth. So I'm going to show you the rim light by itself. And then we're going to turn the rim light on with the fill and the key. And in this particular case, we're just using a nice small strip box, which has given us just a nice soft, tightly controlled separation right there on the head and shoulder. And so this, when combined with everything else, looks like this. And then we're going to take that and we're going to combine it with the other lights. So we started with the key, we added in fill, and we added in the rim. Now the last thing we're going to do is add a little bit of depth to the background. And for that we're going to use a background light. So again, 4 big descriptors: key, fill, rim, and background. And for the background we have just a standard head with a 10-degree grid. I'm going to turn this on. Oh, there we go. And I've got it positioned right behind the subject's head. It's pretty even. And so it's going to look like this. Not really going to see much of anything except the background. It also creates a nice vignette on the background as well. And there we go. And then finally we turn everything on and we put it all together. We've got the key, the fill, the rim, and the background light, and we get this. Okay? And you don't have to use all these. You can kind of use any combination you want. You can use one, or you can use many. You can use 20 different lights to accomplish these 4 different things. The point is just to kind of know what you want and really know what the intent of a light should be, versus just throwing up a bunch of lights and thinking that it should go this way or that way. Think about what the purpose of the light is, and it's really going to help you a lot when planning out how to light your image. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is lighting ratios. Now, lighting ratios is kind of one of those things that I like to use as a way to teach and explain light, but some people don't like to use lighting ratios for the same reason that some people don't like to use lighting meters, and that's fine. Just know that when you learn with the light meter, you tend to get a little bit more comfortable with specifically how light behaves, and it tends to get you there a little bit quicker, at least initially. You don't have to take the picture, check the button, check the camera, and go back and forth. Now, the more comfortable you get with your equipment, probably the less you're going to use a light meter. Just because you know how it behaves. You know when you put this modifier on, or you move the light this much, or you dial it down this much, it's going to behave in a way that you're familiar with. But for our sake, for the teaching portion of this, the learning portion of this, we're going to use the light meter, and we're going to explore the idea of lighting ratios, which is to say we're going to take the key and we're going to manipulate the power of the fill to control the overall contrast of the image by controlling the contrast of the face, which is how bright or how dark the face is. So we're going to look at a variety. We're basically going to look at the range. We're going to look at a 1-to-1 where the shadow is even with the key and the lighting is very flat. And we're going to bring it down all the way to about the point where you start losing a bunch of information, which is about a 4-stop range. So as soon as you're about 4 stops underneath the key, you start to lose a lot of detail. But before we delve into that, you've heard me mention stops quite a bit. And so let's just for a second discuss what stops are. Every 3 clicks of your wheel, whether you're on shutter speed, whether you're on aperture, whether you're on ISO, doubles or halves the amount of light that your camera can read. And that's a stop. So 3 clicks doubles or halves the light in each direction. When you go up from f8 to f11, you are requiring twice as much light to get the same exposure. When you go from 8 to 5/6, you're needing half as much light. It's the same like going from 1/125th to 1/250th of a second. Obviously, it's a little bit different in the studio, but when you're looking at continuous light, when you go from ISO 100 to 200, you need half as much light. So that's kind of how it works. Every time you double or halve the number with ISO or shutter speed, you are requiring half as much or twice as much light. Now, how that actually translates isn't totally a 50% brighter in the overall image. So it does take a little bit of experimentation to get used to it. But the more you play with it and the more you use that, you'll know what a 3-stop difference looks like, or a 2-stop or a 4-stop difference. And it allows you to control the image in a much more specific way. And you can pre-visualize it, and you can build all these lights complexly without ever having to check the back of the camera until you're ready to fine-tune. And so that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to start with the 1-to-1. And we're going to work through a 1-stop difference, a 2-stop difference, a 3-stop difference, and a 4-stop difference. And we're going to show you them all side by side so you can take that idea and you can apply it to your own lighting. Now, in this particular case, we're also only applying it to the key and the fill. You can use ratios and underexposing and overexposing. When you take your lights on location, and you can underexpose ambient and stuff like that. It just becomes a good way for us to read light in a consistent way. So we're going to start with the key light, and the key light is set at f11. And we're also going to turn on the fill light, and the fill light's going to read f11. And there's a couple of different ways we can read that. Either we can turn the light off completely if we don't want to get this confusing our reading at all. So like I would read this at 11, and I could either block it with my hand, or I can turn it in, or a combination of the two, right? And that'll help me get a more direct reading off of the fill light, or we could just straight turn it off. But I'm reading this as 11, and I'm reading this as 11, and we've already adjusted those power settings. The cool thing about these lights is, generally speaking, moving down, because it goes from 2 to 10, and its power settings. If I go from 10 to 9, that's about a stop. It's technically a stop in its output, and it's going to translate to about a stop here, at least relatively. So I know that's going to be a pretty good starting place for how I move through the apertures and the f-stops. So this is going to be a 1-to-1, which is both of them metering at f11. Yeah, we'll go ahead and meter it. All right, so you want to fire that for me, please? Okay, so we're gonna meter here. Try that one more time. Okay, that's reading 11, and I'm going to come here. That's reading 13, so let's take that down just a little bit. Now it's reading f11. So we're 11 and 11 on both sides, and that's going to look like this. A 1-to-1 ratio is pretty flat. It's not really going to have a whole lot of depth, not a whole lot of shadow. You can mix qualities of light when you're doing keys and fills. I regularly like to use a hard key with a soft fill. In this particular instance, we're using a soft key and a soft fill, so everything looks very soft. You can also go hard and hard. Generally speaking, a soft key with a hard fill can look a little bit distracting. That's probably the one that I would personally shy away from. But you can see 1-to-1 on both sides. It's pretty even light across both sides of the face. Now, we're going to take it down a little bit. So the exposure is not going to change on the camera. We're going to stay at f11. This doesn't change. The only thing we're going to do is we're going to change the power output of the fill. And so we're going to take it down about a full stop and give us a starting place. So we know that if we're starting at f11, we're going to turn this down and try to get it to read f8. That's 7-1. Oh, one more time. It's 9. 8. Okay? This is going to be a one-stop difference. And in a one-stop difference, you're going to have a noticeable carving, in this particular case from the key light, but the shadow is going to be pretty bright. So you're going to notice the shape of the light, but it's still going to be pretty bright. It's going to be a nice poppy light. You see it a lot, pretty commonly in advertising images. And there we go. Now, benefit of putting this light close to camera is you don't really notice it too much, so it just evenly fills in the light. And I happen to think it gives it a nice painterly feel. All right, so we're going to turn this power down another stop. We're going to create a 2-stop difference. So we're going to go from 8 to 5-6, and that's what we want this to read. 6-3, 5-6. Now this is going to give us, we saw the 2.6 a little bit earlier when we were setting up the Giving Your Light a Job video. But this 2-stop difference is going to give us a little bit of a darker tone on the shadow, but it's still going to put it squarely in the brighter part of those shadow tones. So it's going to be a little bit more dramatic, going to create a little bit more carving on the face, but it's not going to be super dark. And that gives us a 2-stop difference. Now if we take it down one more stop, we're going to go from 5-6 to 4. So 3 clicks down on that aperture. If we're changing it, we're not changing the exposure. We're still sitting at f11. Nothing has changed on the camera. We're going from 5-6 to 4. Okay? So we want this to read 4. That's 4. Very good. Very good. So 4 is going to give us a 3-stop difference between the key and the fill. So that's a lot of light we're going down. 3 is about the threshold for when you're just on the verge of losing shadow detail. So it's going to be pretty dark, not quite clipped, but really at that low end of the shadow tones, and it's just, like I said, the threshold of losing shadow detail. So it's going to be a much more dramatic carving on the cheek. And that's your 3-stop difference. And we're going to take it down one more to the very bottom of that. And we're going to lose a lot of shadow detail in those tones, which is okay. We're going to make something really dramatic and really dark. We're going to do a 4-stop difference. And we're going to make this read 2.8. Now sometimes the power of this doesn't go to a 4-stop difference. You really have to get a lot of power out of this to make sure you're creating that discrepancy between the output. You may have to turn this off. You may have to bring in negative fill. Sometimes there's different ways you can manipulate that fill. But we're going to try to get this to read 2.8. 2.2. 2.5. 2.8. 4-stop difference. You're going to see lots of dark tones on those shadows. And And you can obviously keep going with that if you have the capability to do so. So for example, we may be even be able to push that beyond 4 stops into really, really dark tones. If we shut that light off completely, we brought in negative fill, and if you wanted to make those shadows really dark, you could really bring it in to do so. The reason I like to have a lot of control is, again, I've said this before, when you bring it into the development process, either through Capture One or Lightroom, if you put it squarely in that shadow slider, you can manipulate the way that looks without affecting your highlight tones, and it gives you a lot more versatility on the back end. So what we are now looking at from start to finish, we didn't change the overall exposure at all. 1:1 when they were both there. As soon as this gets brighter than this, it's no longer the fill. It's the key. So at 1:1, they're perfectly balanced. It keeps us at an F11 across the board with both of these. We brought it down a stop. F11, this is now reading F8. The overall exposure doesn't change. Starts to get a little bit more curvature on that left side of the face. 1 stop below that, it's reading 5.6. Gets a little bit darker. 1 stop below that is 4. Even darker, and 1 stop below that, we're reading 2.8. That's a 4-stop difference between the two. And the more you do this, the more you'll get familiar with what that looks like. And you can plan for that ahead of time. You can meter it, and you can pre-visualize exactly what the tonal ranges and the contrast and the shadows are going to look like in your lighting before you ever even have to check it and tweak it. Now, I know this can be a little bit complicated, and it runs into a lot of numbers and a little bit of math. So don't be afraid to go back and watch this again to double check it. I find it can be a little bit confusing the first time around, but it does give a lot of flexibility and a lot of versatility and a lot of control when it comes to lighting your images. All right, so now we're going to explore and take a look at the shape of some modifiers in a little bit more detail. Obviously, modifiers come in a variety of shapes and sizes. We're going to look at some of the more common shapes, which is the octabox. We're going to look at the rectangular softbox, the strip box, the umbrella, and the beauty dish. And you've seen a few of these throughout the course of the few videos, but what key differences I want you to kind of notice when we use these relatively close and soft is actually how similar they are. And you're going to see that a lot of these different modifiers produce relatively similar results. You're going to see slight differences in the specularity or in the contrast, but truth be told, they're quite a bit more similar than you might think. There are some slight variations for how they control light, but what you're really going to see the difference in is in the catch lights and the shape of the reflection of the light in the eyes. And that can have a variety of different results or can be decided because of different kinds of purposes. And we're going to talk about those a little bit more in a second. So before we dig into a few of these different modifiers, we're going to do a quick little control test with just this hard light. Obviously, we've seen the hard light before, but we're also going to look a little bit closer at the catch light. And we're going to move in close. We're going to do this for each of them with the catch light. Okay. The catch light in this one is going to be pretty small. All right, so the first modifier we're going to look at is going to be the octabox, and this is a 4-foot octabox, 8 sides, octa, and it's going to be a pretty soft light. This particular one has 1 baffle. Sometimes you'll see multiple baffles, and these come in a variety of different configurations and sizes, but this is going to create a round catch light in the eyes. And some photographers, you know, catering to a certain kind of OCD, they like the round concentric circles inside the eyes, so they'll regularly use round modifiers, whether it's an octabox or the beauty dish or other things. So we're going to take a look at the octabox first. And we are going to bring all these modifiers in pretty close to show you that, you know, soft light is soft light. Bring that in nice and close. There we go. All right, now let's get a meter on this. 11, great. Moving close. Great. So this is the octabox. All right, the next one we're going to take a look at is the 4x6 rectangular softbox. Again, these come in a lot of different sizes. This one's pretty large, meaning it's going to be pretty soft. Has 2 baffles on the inside. The shape is going to be a rectangle. Okay. Remember, we are pointing the middle, the hot spot area at the face, so we're going to need to bring that up just a tiny bit. There we go. And again, we're going to get a meter on this. Go ahead. We're at 8. Inner baffle made us lose about an extra stop of power. Great. All right, so that is the rectangular softbox. All right. Next one we're going to take a look at is an umbrella. Again, comes in a variety of sizes. This one here is the XL, so it's pretty large. Remember, the umbrellas have no hotspot because they bounce. So they're going to give us a nice wide, soft spread of light. Looks like this. And for that, we have to flip the light away. It is going to take away a little bit of power from the light, but it's going to make it softer and more even. Okay, and the meter. 8. And the close-up. Great. All right, so we're going to take that off, and we're going to take a look at the strip. And this is a small strip. Some strips are very large. This one is a little bit smaller. This is only about a 3-foot tall strip, and it's only you know, less than a foot wide. It's pretty small. These aren't often used as main lights, but we are using one as a main light. It's going to the softness is going to be similar to other soft boxes of the size, but the point is you're going to see a tighter channel of light, and you're going to see less light on the background when we use this. All right, and so we have the strip box here. It's going to, like I said, create a little bit more of a tight channel of light, so we're going to get less light on the background. It's going to be darker shadows on the side of the face, so the whole thing is going to feel a little bit more contrasty, but you'll notice the edge of the light's still going to be pretty soft. So let's get a meter on this. Great. And then I'm going to move in pretty close. Great. And then finally, the last one we're going to look at is the beauty dish. And the beauty dish is a very soft light because it uses the idea of diffused reflection, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So the plate is meant to block the direct light that comes out. It bounces off and then bounces off all of this other white light here. And you can put a diffuser on this, you can put a grid on it to really isolate and channel the light. So this can be modified a little bit more. But the idea is that it just creates really soft light. It's also going to be pretty punchy, pretty contrasty, but no discernible highlight in the middle, and that's kind of what's unique about this light. Okay, we're at 10. Okay. Great. And what we're kind of looking at as we look through these images is we're going to put up the 5 portraits side by side. And although the contrast changes a little bit in the image, what I want you to really focus on is what that gradation of shadow looks like from light to dark. And you'll notice that they all pretty much do a similar thing, which is they soften that gradation from light to dark. And it's going to create soft light in a variety of different circumstances. You're going to see some produce a little bit more contrast, some produce a tighter channel of light, which is kind of the purpose of a thinner softbox or a smaller modifier. But basically what they're all trying to do is create soft light. So why do we pick one versus the other? Well, a beauty dish, for example, might give us a little bit more specularity. A strip box might create a tighter channel. But when it comes to an octabox or a rectangular softbox, as long as they're both relatively the same size, you're going to get pretty consistently soft light. So the difference is the catch light. And we're going to look at that in just a second. But before we do, we're going to look at all of them together side by side. And truth be told, in a blind taste test, I think the vast majority of people would find it kind of difficult if the eyes were closed to tell which was which. And I always think this is a really kind of an interesting experiment. The only one that's really drastically different from all of these is the strip, which is the 4th image. And it doesn't get a lot of light on the background because it created that tighter channel of light. But if you actually look at the rest of them, the light is pretty similar. It's kind of surprisingly similar. The difference between maybe like a rectangular versus an octagonal is some people think that a rectangular can give you a little bit more control when you want to feather the background and moving it from side to side. But there's really not a massive difference when you're considering the overall scope of the image. Now we are going to zoom in and we're going to look at the catch lights on each of these. So we're going to look at a close-up version of the face, and I want you to pay close attention to the catch lights. Now this is going to be particularly useful when you ever want to see how the light was created or shaped, or you want to kind of decode what was happening. And the catch light becomes almost like a backstage view into what was happening with the lights, because it's reflecting what's happening, at least to the front. And so sometimes it can give you a lot of understanding and a lot of help when you want to figure out what it is. But all you have to really do is know what they look like. So let's visit these catch lights. The image on the left, the very first one, is the octabox. And you can clearly see there is a round octagonal shape in the eye. Right? It's a circle inside a circle, relatively, right? So that gives that concentric circle. This is a giant rectangular softbox. It's going to give you something that looks kind of similar to a window. We have the umbrella. Usually the way to tell is you can see the light stand or the C-stand, whatever you happen to have in it, and you can kind of see it, but it's still a round shape. Then we have the strip, narrower rectangle. And then finally we have the beauty dish. And usually the giveaway for the beauty dish is it kind of almost looks like a donut, and you can see a dark spot in the plate where that middle should be. That's usually the way we tell the difference. And there are a few other modifiers out there that kind of create different catch lights, but it becomes a really useful way that we can decode the image and see how all of these different modifiers respond in the scene. so the methodology of lighting is pretty simple, right? You put light where you want it, and you block light where you don't. And so far, for the most part, we've talked about putting light where you want it. And now we're going to talk about controlling it a little bit more, and blocking it where you don't want it. And we're going to look at a variety of different modifiers to get there. So we're going to talk about grids. We're going to talk about barn doors, snoots, grids on modifiers, and we're going to bring out the flags. And so those are just different ways in which we can block light. So we're going to start with the grids. And grids come in a variety of different sizes and configurations. And right here we have a 5, 10, and a 20-degree grid. This is a 20-degree grid. It's kind of like this honeycomb pattern that fits on top of the light, and sometimes they're big and sometimes they're small, and it basically creates these tiny little channels that help focus the light. What I like about grids, they actually don't change the quality of light. They just make the spread more focused. And so since we have a hard light, it's still going to be hard light, but you're going to notice how the spread changes. So we're going to look at it on the wall first before we bring in our model, and we're going to see how those look at different degrees. Now you can also change the spread by alternating distance as well. So you're going to use a combination of distance and grid degrees to really tighten the beam to get what you want. So we have the 20-degree grid. Now here we have for control, you can see that the beam is pretty tight in the middle, or sorry, it's pretty bright in the middle, and then it spreads across the whole wall. And yet when we put this 20-degree grid on, that beam gets more focused. Cool thing about grids is the edge isn't abrupt. It just becomes a way to channel that light into a narrower beam. It's not going to create a spotlight effect. It's just going to control the light a little bit tighter. So this is a 20. This is the 10. And you'll notice the honeycomb pattern in this particular instance is relatively similar, but the barrel is a little bit longer. And then finally we have the 5. And the 5 has a pretty long barrel, but the grid pattern here is pretty small and focused. And that creates a pretty tight beam of light. I'm going to show you the 3 of these side by side. This is 5, 10, 20, none. Another way in which we can focus the light is the snoot. And the snoot does kind of a similar thing, creates a channel of light, but the difference between the snoot is you're going to notice a more prominent hot spot in the middle. It actually kind of changes the quality of light a little bit, and it gives you a little bit more of an abrupt edge. So you can see it is a little bit different than the grids. Next we have the barn doors. And the barn doors have a series of flaps kind of on the edges that allow you to shape and control the light, creating either a narrow channel, or you're able to control that light to not be on the background, create a small channel in the face, so forth and so on. And you can move this in a variety of configurations. When it's wide open, you'll notice no difference. There we go. No difference from the hot light, but as you can see, if we wanted to bring some light off the floor, we could do that. You want to bring a light a little bit off the top or from the sides. You can create a more focused beam. You can create a totally narrow channel, and you can really fine-tune and manipulate this light to control it to be exactly what you want. Modifiers, like beauty dishes and softboxes, also have grids. Whenever you see a grid on a softbox, it's usually a little bit of a honeycomb, soft thing that velcros to the outside of it. I really like the grid on a beauty dish which again looks just like a regular grid, just much bigger, because it allows you to really focus the beam and take a lot of spill and light off the background. And it just kind of fits on the inside of this and does this. And that's the grid on the beauty dish. So I'm going to show you with and without how that changes. Here's the beauty dish. We've already seen what that beauty dish looks like on the subject. Pretty widespread. There we go. And that creates a much narrower beam on the background. Finally, we have the flag. The flag is one of my favorite modifiers of light, and it's underutilized by a lot of people. It's very, very powerful. Basically, the flag is just a metal frame, comes in a lot of different sizes, wrapped in a very absorbent black fabric that either can darken shadows or absorb light. So we use it as a way to create negative fill when it's next to the face. You can also use it as a way to block light from hitting the background or create intentional create intentional shadows on the face. Now, the thing about barn doors was the modification was really close to the light itself. So that makes it very soft. With the flag, you can take that flag and move it pretty far off of the light, and you can create a much harder shadow. So the closer the modification is to your subject, the harder it will be. So by taking the modification off the light, we have a lot more control about what that shadow is going to do. So we can either use it as a way to block light from hitting part of the image, like the background, or we could use it as a way to create intentional shadows on the face. And I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do that. But basically, blocks the light. All right, now we're going to bring our subject in, and we're going to demonstrate all of these with an actual person so we can kind of see a little bit better how they are applied to a person. Okay, great. Let's set that right there. Perfect. Make sure we're woken up. So, we are going to position this light a little bit higher. We're going to do more of an angular light so we can make it a little bit more flattering, a little bit more dramatic on the face. Bring it down a little bit. Okay. All right, let's get a control. I'm going to get a little meter on here. Get a meter? Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Okay, so we're 11. All right, so this is going to be our control with no modifier. Great. Now, we're going to start with the 20-degree grid. And we're going to lose a little bit of light on these grids as we go. So we're going to make sure we remeter, and we're going to try our best to keep the light pointed at the face. 8. So we already lost about a stop. Great. Okay. And then we're going to swap that out with the 10. Okay. About the same. And then one more. Really tight on the face. Same. All right. So let's take a look at the 4 of these images side by side. So in the first image, we've got no modification whatsoever. It's pretty open, pretty hard. Then we move into the 20 degree, then the 10 degree, then the 5 degree. And you can see by the time we get to the 5 degree image, the sweet spot of light's pretty small. You got to be careful when you're using that tight of a pocket of light. Sometimes the bottom of the face may not have enough light, and that can run into some problems for you. It changes the skull, changes the color of skin a little bit, so you really want to be super aware of that. All right, so let's put the snoot on and take a look at what that does. Just hold that up there for me,
No
please. Oop. Right there, perfect. And we're going to do a little meter on that. So it is a little bit brighter. We're at F10 now. All right. And you can see in this image, it is actually noticeably brighter on the face. We do have a definitive hot spot in that kind of a modification. All right, now we're going to throw the barn doors on. Let's put that this way. All right. So obviously wide open. It's going to look the same. Let's go ahead and get a meter on this light just so we can confirm. 11. It is going to be the same as wide open. But I'm actually going to move it a little bit to the side so that I can block that background light a little bit more. Make it a little bit of a better use for the barn doors. All right, so at the moment, completely wide open, right? And as we close these in, you'll notice you get a little bit more shadow on the background. Where basically our threshold is right about when it starts to appear on our shoulder. That means it's going to be right about where we want to cut it. And you can see right around then, it starts to get a little bit darker on this side of the face. And we're going to bring this in a little bit more as well, just to give us a little bit of control. Get that extra spill off the background. And if we want to bring it up off a little bit off the bottom, we can. And same with the top. And we're basically going to cut light from the background. And we lost a little bit of light on the face, but it's still pretty close. So we probably want to compensate that and brighten that exposure up just a tiny bit. Let's double check that meter just so that we can make sure we're in the right spot. Okay. So we lost about a stop. And there we go. That looks much better when we compare the two. Okay, so the first one is wide open. The second one is we've created a little bit more of a tight channel using the barn doors. And you can isolate how that light looks pretty simply. All right, let's take that off. All right, next we're going to take a look at the beauty dish. And we're going to move that in a little bit closer because the beauty dish really shines when it's pretty close. So we're going to move it in nice and close, nice and tight, get a really soft contrasty light. And then we're going to bring in the grid and show you how that's going to isolate the subject from the background in that way too. And the grid's going to give us a little bit more control. Okay. All right. So this beautiful light, super soft, super pretty, but it is definitely lighting the background, right? And there are different ways we could manipulate this if we want. If we wanted to bring her way off the background, we can isolate it that way. But sometimes you only have a limited amount of space. So a grid allows you to focus that light and get a little bit more of that light off the background. And the quality of light on the face doesn't change. We have to compensate exposure. but it allows us more control in a tighter space. And that's pretty cool. All right. Last thing we're going to take a look at is the flag. And the flag is unique to a lot of these other modifiers because it works with whatever existing modifier you have. So whereas the barn doors is going to be a pretty hard light, the grids are going to be a pretty hard light, the flag works with whatever you have. So we could technically use the flag with the beauties for the grid, or we could use it with a hard light by itself, or you could use it with an octabox, or you could use it with a scrim. We're going to make the light hard only to make it easier for you guys to see the shadow, but know that the flag can be used in a lot of different configurations with a lot of other modifiers, and it plays really nicely. Okay. So, let's also keep in mind this is a relatively small flag. Flags can be very large and they can block bigger parts of the background, so you will see a much smaller shadow because of this flag, the size of this flag, but just know that sometimes you may want to use a bigger flag. All right, so we're going to get a control image. Okay. All right, hard light. All right, good. Now, let's say we wanted to block that light from hitting the background. We could bring in the flag. We bring it right up. Another really useful way to use the flag is if you pay close attention to the shadow on the background. So I know kind of about how close I want to bring it in as soon as this shadow starts to interact with her shadow. So I'm actually looking a little bit at her, but I'm also looking at the shadow on the background. And that's hitting that shoulder. I can see it's hitting the shoulder. If I'm here, it's not. Okay? And how you change the angle is going to change how things look there. All right, so I'm going to do that. Block the background light. Turn a little bit more to me, please. Great. Okay. And here I've blocked the light from the background. Okay, now, you can also use the flag to create shape and shadow from the front. So, if I happen to want to create a little bit of a defined shadow on the side of the face, I bring it in. And again, the closer it is to the light, the softer it's going to be. The closer it is to your subject, the harder it's going to be. So when you want to create these little pocket channels of light, this is how you do it. All right, let's get a little bit of a meter on that face. I might have lost a little bit. There you go.
4, 5, yeah.
Okay, woo, lost a lot. Turn it to the light. All right, 4, 5. Let's see. Okay, and what we have is this very soft, beautiful cut of light across the face. Now, if you want to make that more defined, all you got to do is bring it closer to your subject, a little bit further away from the light. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. There we go. Can you bring it up a little bit higher, please? Now I'm paying close aware because this is a smaller flag that I want to make sure that shadow is covered pretty consistently across my background. I don't want to see any of the edges of it. Can you lean forward just a little bit for me, please? Perfect. Good, and let's get a test on that. Great. The other thing about this is because we're using a more abrupt edge, it's getting a lot more light on the face, so we want to make sure we're paying close attention to that. Now for me, I'm not going to use this in conjunction, or sorry, I'm not going to use this by itself. I'm going to use this in conjunction with controlling fill and a variety of other instances. But that's how you create that cut of light across the face, and you're going to see me manipulate that similar effect over the course of the shoot production days, but we're going to do it in a few different ways, and we're really going to control the fill and put a lot of the techniques that we learn in terms of lighting and fill and cutting the light all together to create some more beautifully crafted pockets of light. All right, so we've covered a lot of things over the course of this tutorial. We've covered hard light and soft light and different kinds of modifiers, sizes and shapes, and relative size and relative position. There are a few things that don't really fit into any of those categories. A few of my favorite kinds of light modifiers that don't really fit into those categories. And I love weird, unusual light. And we're going to look at three of those. Three of those that we're going to see probably quite a bit over the shoot days. And those three modifiers that I use a lot that don't really fit into those categories are the umbrella with diffusion, the ring flash, and the spot projector. And they're three specialty modifiers. Okay? All right, so the first one we're going to take a look at is the umbrella with diffusion. But before we look at it with diffusion, let's look at it without, so we can kind of see the difference. And it's going to be a subtle difference. Part of it is just going to take the power down, but it's also going to give us a more consistent spread. So that's going to be a little bit more useful when you want a little bit of versatility and flexibility when you're shifting that light around. Now we're at F9. Okay, and we have a pretty dramatic light happening here. The shadow side of the face is pretty dark. There we go. Excellent. Now we're going to add this layer of diffusion across the front of the umbrella. We're not going to change the power setting. We're not going to change the position. So you're going to see that there's going to be a little bit of a loss of power here. Okay. Throw that in for me, please. Great. Okay. All right, beautiful. Let's back it up a little bit. Let's raise it up a bit. A little bit more. Great. And let's meter that. All right. Okay, and let's look at the two side by side. All right, so as you can see, there is a very slight difference. If you pay close attention to those gradations of shadow over by the cheek, you can see it is just a little bit softer. And so this is about as soft as you can get light. It's a large source, it's bounced, and it's diffused, so it kind of hits all of these check marks, and it really basically produces like super, super soft light. It's kind of tough to get light that's any softer than this. So I like to use it because it is just the softest light you can use. All right, so that's the umbrella with diffusion. You'll see me use this as a key, and you'll also see me use this as a fill. All right, next one we're going to take a look at is the ring flash. And the ring flash is kind of unique to itself. We talked about light being relative and the position of light being relative, and the ring flash is mounted around the camera. And it was originally created for dental photography to create virtually shadowless light, because since the light surrounds the lens, light hits it from all angles, and it makes it relatively shadowless. The effect is it actually creates something of a halo shadow all around the image, which was popular in the 80s and 90s, and I think Robert Palmer used it in a music video. But I digress. The way it actually shows up is, you actually see the tube behind it. I'm a fan of putting a couple layers of ND on the top of it because I use it so subtly, especially with this super soft diffused light. You're not necessarily getting a whole lot of power out of your lights. So this allows me to really just slightly give a little bit of a kick. And what it also ends up doing is it produces something of an illustrative effect to the shadows with the fill. It's a very unique kind of fill. It's not like using a big soft fill or a reflector. It actually creates a slight specularity. It really accentuates a lot of textures. So if you've got leather, shiny surfaces, or muscles, it just adds a little extra sheen to the highlights on the image, and it makes it look a little bit more illustrative. So I'm going to show it to you both the key light, show you what the effect looks like strong, and then we're going to pair it with an octabox as a key so you can see it as a fill. So we're going to attach this to the camera and take a look at what this looks like. Okay, so what we have is the ring light attached, and we're going to use this as a key light just so you can see what that halo shadow we're talking about looks like. It's also going to create kind of a unique catch light in the eye. It's going to create like that donut right in the dead center. So sometimes if you have a really high key light, this is going to come in and it's going to make sure you have a catch light in that eye. The closer this is, the bigger it's going to be. And it's also the closer she is to the background, the smaller that halo is going to be. All right, so we're going to bring this in as the key. And I'm at 9, okay? So I'm going to go 2 stops up. It's going to put me at 18. Okay? And I want to try to make sure this reads 18. I could go the other way with it. I could dictate this first, and then I could come in and control this. But since we already have it set up, we're just going to go jump 2 stops over this. So let's go ahead and meter the key light and see if we can get it to 18.
Okay. 20. Okay. 16. It's like splitting here. It's real small.
Okay.
All right, one more. Okay, yeah, it's between 15 and 20.
Okay, so what we've got is we're at 18 on the key. This is still going to shape the light, but what we're going to use is the ring flash to come in and control the shadows. Kind of similar to how we did it with the ratios earlier, but it's going to give a slightly different effect. It's going to be a little bit more illustrative and a little bit more snappy in the shadows. There we go. Okay. And that's about a 2-stop difference. Okay. Now with it off, I'm going to show you the difference. Try that one more time. Okay, pretty dark. So what it does is it gives you this nice, soft, painterly fill to the shadows, and it's kind of unique. You'll also see this used in advertising with like a hard key and a ring flash fill, and it just gives you a whole lot of control between the two. Right. So on the far left image, you can see the ring flash by itself. We've got a little bit of a color shift because of the ND filters. In the second image, you can see the ring flash as fill, and on the right image, you can see the octabox by itself. All right. So the last specialty modifier we're going to look at is something called the spot projector, and it is one of my absolute favorite modifiers. It's a little bit of a pricier modifier. It was definitely a save-up purchase. So what this basically does is it allows you to fit in some kind of a lighting pattern. These are called gobos. That stands for go-between. I've got several patterns that come with this, and you can project things like windows and rain and all kinds of things. And this is actually one that I use quite a bit, which is just a long rectangle. What makes this tool so unique is on the end of it, there's a lens. And it moves back and forth. And you can focus the lens. And that's super useful because when you put a pattern in here, you can actually dictate how sharp or out of focus that pattern is. So if you've got a pattern of leaves, you can make them super sharp or super out of focus. Or you can vary where that focus happens to be based on where the light is. So whereas the grids just basically tightened that channel of light but still left the edge pretty soft. The snoot made it a little bit harder. The barn doors kind of blocked it. And the flags made it pretty hard. This allows you to cut and shape light in either a pattern or a shape razor sharp. Without a pattern, it kind of has that effect of a spotlight from a theater. So it kind of looks like this. On the background, right? Spotlight. And it basically gives you the sharpest possible edge you can really get. You need the lens. So anytime you see like patterns projected, it's something like this. You can cut holes in cardboard, but you're really never going to get that crisp, sharp effect without a projector of some kind, because you need the lens, you need to be able to focus it. And you can kind of see how you can actually defocus it if you want to make it have the effect of a grid, or you can make it super sharp. So what you can end up doing here is start cutting light or creating feathered light, feathered focus light on the face. And even though the edge is soft, the light itself is hard. And that kind of is it's a pretty cool thing to be able to use. Okay? Other than that, it still just looks like a regular hard light. Now, what I've got here is a gobo. And this is a gobo that I use all the time. That's probably the one that I use by far the most. It's a rectangle. And it kind of does the same thing that I was doing with flags, wherein you'd bring in several flags to create this strip of light. It's going to look the same, but I get to do it on the modifier in a really confined space. So this I can throw in a bag, I can put in a backpack, and it basically allows me to create the equivalent of light shaped by like 4 flags on different arms and stands in that amount of space. And it looks like this. And as you can see, super similar effect to the flag. But the cool thing about it is, remember how we moved the flag closer or further away to feather that edge? Soft, soft, hard. And so it's totally up to you what you want this pattern to look like. I'm going to get a meter on this and show you a few different varieties.
7-1.
Okay. Here it is pretty hard. This is going to be a little bit softer. And then we can also do something like this, where it's completely defocused, and it creates this beautiful pocket of light. And we're not going to use this by itself. We're going to use this in combination with several other lights, background lights and rim lights, and we're going to use it with fill, different kinds of fill, soft fill and ring flash fill. And we're going to combine a lot of these different concepts together. But we are going to really shape light in a really fun and creative way. Now, that kind of takes care of the different ways we can modify light. There is something I do want to address, though, and that is the concept of gear and knowing light. So, the big thing is that you got to remember light is light. It doesn't matter if you're sitting with $10,000 of lighting gear or you go to Home Depot and you buy $30 of lighting gear. If you understand how to use and manipulate light, you can make beautiful light in a variety of different circumstances. The gear I use makes my life easier. It's a luxury. It's not a necessity, it's a luxury. It's kind of a necessity for me because I'm really used to it. But you know, at the end of the day, it's all about how you use what you have. And anyone can make a mess of a lot of money worth of gear, or they can make something cheap look beautiful. It's just a matter of what you do with it. And the things that we use, the tools that we use, do make a difference at a certain point, but it does take a while to get there. I have a camera that has, the 645. It's got great dynamic range. It's got great shadow detail because I shoot a lot of dark tones, so that helps me in my work. It makes my life easier. I could also add another light or reflector or control things a little bit differently, and I could shift the way that control works. But this allows me to work easier, and it makes my life easier, and that's of value to me. With the lighting gear that I use, yeah, I could go out and use flags to create a very similar effect, but this makes my life easier because I can do it in a smaller amount of space, and it comes at a premium. It's it's not cheap gear. It's really well made, but it's meant to help me, not be a crutch. So that's always a really important, I think, takeaway when it comes to light, is that for the most part, it took me a long time to get to the point where gear mattered. And in the beginning, there are certain gear that is integral, right? If you were a chef in a kitchen, you don't need the most expensive kitchen money can buy, but you need a good set of pans, you need a good set of knives, you need a few integral things. And that's kind of key here. A good, consistent light, a monolight, is great. There's a lot of different things that I think are really great staples. So for me, if I had like a D1, which is a really reasonably priced monolight, and I threw it on an umbrella with a diffuser, I'd be pretty happy. That'd be one of like the first staples I'd buy, right? Get a camera that works well for you. At the end of the day, that's really what it's about more than anything else. And then think about the ecosystem you want to be involved in. If you like a particular set of a lighting brand's modifiers, or you like their customer service, or you like their warranty system, or whatever it is, these are all of the things that we think about in the greater scheme of things. I think someone told me once, if you buy the expensive umbrella first, you only cry once, which was a piece of advice that I always like. So there is value in good products and the ecosystem that surrounds it. So let's not, I'm not downplaying that idea. But at the end of the day, know where the value is and know how that value translates to what is most effective to help you create the images. Think about what kind of imagery you want to create stylistically, and what kind of story you want to tell, and then use the tools that you know. The idea of shaping light and crafting light, and using your sense of personal style and photo retouching and all of these things to help tell the greater idea. You just have to think more about what that idea is and how you can articulate it. And so you just take these tools, and all of these tools are meant to help you facilitate your vision. All you have to do is know what your vision is. And the only way to do that is to get out and experiment and shoot and shoot and shoot, and the more you do it, the more you'll be able to figure out what you want to do. And then everything else just falls into place.